Attention, please. This tape is on El Greco and Diego Velázquez. Put in the first slide, please. In all of Spain's history, they have produced only 3 painters of major rank, and one of them wasn't even Spanish. El Greco, E-L-G-R-E-C-O, whose dates are 1541 to 1614, was actually a Greek born on the island of Crete. He made his way, after some early study with monks in the monastery, to Italy, to Venice, where he studied with Tintoretto. We can see great relationships between the styles of the exaggerated use of color. But then finally made his way into Spain and settled in the town of Toledo, and there he lived for the rest of his life. His early works are built on a more classic manner and in the style of the sort of opulent, rich Venetian period, especially that of Tintoretto. And then his later style carries on this sort of dramatic use of color with an extended figure to fit within his own ideas of rhythm, movement, and drama. We have the first 2 paintings that we'll see are 2 different versions of Christ cleansing the temple. This one, an earlier one, much more in the manner of Tintoretto, and slide please. A later version, much more in a mature style, with the extended figures, the sort of rubbery skeletal structure, and the dramatic use of the lights and the darks, especially in the drapery. The figures, especially in their construction, seem to float in an ethereal manner, producing the desired emotional effect for these religious Many of these paintings were large in scale. They would fit in large walls or niches within chapels or within churches. El Greco himself had a very small but devoted following and lived a very luxurious life. His home had 47 rooms. He had a vast library. He also wrote many things, not only about painting, but about the humanities. He lived in a very gracious style, often said to import musicians from Venice to entertain at his parties. Slide, please. And was one of the first painters to go to court to sue for collection of payment. His subject matter follows a fairly rigid line. The religious subjects that he would do as commissions for private individuals or for the church, and a few portraits. Slide, please. Within his ideas of this exaggerated movement that follows the Mannerist tradition in Italy of the 16th century, we have the contorted position of the figures. You have lost the quiet, classic serenity of the 15th century, and you're entering into the Baroque period where things keep moving, especially with the whole emotional temperament of the Spanish people. You have a much more lively presentation of the subject matter. These things were painted to instill this sort of emotional devotion from the people. Everything is moving. The contrast of darks and lights keep your eye jumping over the composition. The figures are no longer in straight poses, but in violent S-curves. Lights sort of pull your eye from one area to the other. Slide, please. And in this one, which is a very large painting done for a church, the burial of Count Argaz is about 9 feet tall, and it fits within a rounded arched ceiling wall at the end of the chapel. And here you have an ideal presentation, an early period work of El Greco's painting, of where he divides the earthly to the ethereal. The colors are more somber, the figures are straighter in the lower half of the composition. The Count, who is being held by two patron saints decked in the robes of the church, is being lowered into the grave. The little boy in the lower left-hand corner points to the Count, and where you can't see on the piece of ground the history of his life painted on a piece of paper, which was a very popular thing to do in Spanish painting. In the background, the very somber people dressed in black with the white collars, also fads or fashions of the time, are portraits of the friends of the Count. And then you almost have a horizontal dividing line between the earthbound and the heavenly. The Count's soul floats up to heaven in the form of a little baby, and you see the figure of God sitting in the center, sort of enthroned, with the Virgin Mary and the figure of St. John the Baptist, and you see St. Peter with the emblem of the keys hanging out over the clouds, and all the other saintly people gathered in this sort of Baroque moving cloud formation that has a lot more energy and vitality in the upper portion. Everything seems to be moving around. You have a much more floating quality. Nothing is settled or stayed in the upper portion of this painting. As with most paintings, and I say this over and over again, slide reproductions are just second best in looking at paintings, because you don't have the feeling of the environment of where the original is, or the scale, or the size. Also, one thing you can do in photography is move in close and take details of being able to see, as you should in the museums, walk up close to a painting and study the brushwork or the brush strokes, the surface quality of the work of art. Slide, please. And this one, a close-up of the head of the Count. And then in the robes of the people in the upper portion, we see how El Greco can achieve this sort of sheen and richness to the cloth by the overworking of color, and especially the dragging of the white that gives a transparent look over the little red band in the cloak, of where a color would be laid over another color in a transparent method of adding a richness, a depth of tone that you can achieve in no other way. As with most painters over the centuries, the white is used fairly thick, and the dark colors, to obtain this richness of depth of tone, are applied in a thinner manner. Slide, please. Another very famous painting of El Greco's, and it's about the only landscape that he did other than including it in background details, is the view of Toledo. And the town itself has not changed much over the centuries, and we can still, in a modern-day photograph, pick out the different buildings that El Greco portrayed. But he selected the portrayal of the city even at this dramatic time of an approaching storm. There's much activity going on, and in the original you can see people crossing the bridges, activity that going around in the fields and the outer edges of the city. And as I said, El Greco was a Greek. His real name was Domenico Theotocopuli, and probably to make it a little bit easier for the Spaniards to say, they nicknamed him the Greek, or El Greco. Supposedly not as a fond nickname, but as a put-down each time to remind him that he was not of Spanish birth, but that he was a foreigner to their country, even though he spent most of his time in Spain. But in retaliation, he continually signed all of his paintings in his Greek name rather than the nickname. Slide, please. Another one of his major paintings is the Pietà. It's a fairly large painting, about 3 by 4 feet, and it is done in the pastel, sort of off-tone colors that El Greco liked to use, especially in drapery. The skin is white, pure, even. The figures extended. The muscle structure is there, except it's been extended into these sort of flowing lengths to form this rhythmical pattern over the surface of the painting. Also, there's this extra sort of swirling movement that he achieves in all of his work, of where one thing sort of wraps around another to catch your eye, so that your eye is constantly moving within the composition. Slide, please. He did several versions of St. Martin and the Beggar. It is not known whether he received commissions to do these paintings over and over again, or he just wanted to work on a theme, as we find in later painters, of sort of doing variations on a theme. Except in this one, they're so close, there's so little variation other than in size and possibly cloud formations, that they're more likely thought that they were commissioned by different people, and he just turned them out to provide for the different patrons. In this one, even though you have an awfully static view of a horse that seems awfully stiff in comparison to El Greco's other works, we have an ideal presentation of the El Greco figure in the person of the beggar. You have the extremely thin knees, the thin joints, the feet that are made smaller so that they do not even give a hint of being able to support the body, which then gives sort of a floating, ethereal quality to the figure. They're not earthbound, they're not attached to the soil. And then the elaborate portrayal in the armor of St. Martin as he cuts the cloak in half to give to the beggar. Slide, please. In the portrait of the cardinal, we have again the little overpainting detail, especially in the lace structure of the cassock in the lower part of the painting, and again the little piece of paper that seems casually thrown on the tile floor that gives the history or the biography of the person. The background, very thin and just sort of squiggles of brushes that gives a textured effect to the background. El Greco, as we'll see in some of his later ones, must have painted very fast. Some of his sketches show very free, direct brushwork. It doesn't have all the basic foundation work that we saw in the earlier Renaissance. Slide, please. And some of his portraits. Even the faces were sort of extended, especially with the use of the beard that points the face. But in all of El Greco's work, in the portrait style itself, you have these sort of deep, angular set eyes, the very dark brown eyes that just seem to burn holes through you as the viewer. Slide, please. And supposedly a self-portrait at a very late age. Slide, please. A portrait of King Louis of France. Slide. And a portrait of a friend that was a monk. The hands are especially freewheeling in this presentation, where there's just sort of a slash of color notation and then a few accent lines that form the fingers. More attention was placed to the head. Slide, please. In this one, the Holy Trinity, you have again the very violent S-curve of the figure that lends motion and action into the composition. Slide, please. The betrayal of Christ, a very dramatic moment. We almost see this bent-over figure duplicated from the earlier Christ cleansing the temple. Many times it seems that the positions of the models are very similar. Slide, please. Slide, please. He uses this fairly dark theme of the swirling motion and the light captured in the center and the Assumption of the Virgin, where you have this violent sort of twisted Baroque movement, almost like a spiraling effect as it swirls upward. Typical drapery of El Greco. Slide, please. And in this one, more or less the same thing. The figure of Christ with the very individual halo that El Greco used in his paintings, this sort of little starred diamond effect that sits behind the head. Sometimes he uses it in cloud effects to achieve this, or as in this one, just purely added behind the head. But you have this rising motion, everything leaving the earth, leaving the ground, sort of floating upward. Beautiful treatment of the hands, almost in the Tintoretto manner of foreshortening of the two figures on the right and on the left. Slide, please. The surfaces of El Greco's are beautiful today. Most of them that have been restored over the years have a very nice, even, smooth surface. The paint's not blobbed on in any certain areas. The texture does not show. It's almost that he used a great deal of medium with his paint to make it almost liquid, and then it was applied with a softer brush. Even though it gives for a very dramatic effect, the surface texture is quite smooth. Slide, please. Christ on the Mount of Olives. This is in the National Gallery in London. It's an average-sized canvas, but again, the treatment of the light and dark pattern, the almost abstract treatment of the clouds, the moon breaking through a sort of a thin veil of a cloud in the background, the abstract form of the rock, the apostles sleeping and the soldiers arriving on the right-hand side. Slide, please. And this one, when he portrays the Virgin Mary, the colors usually go into a more pastel or lighter key. You have the vase of flowers in the lower hand, the Virgin's at sort of a prie-dieu, reading from the prayer book, and the angel and the Holy Spirit in the form of the dove come down from the sort of the crashing heavens. Slide, please. Madonna painting. Slide, please. The crowning of the Virgin. The color is a little off in the slide. It's much more from pastel. It's surrounded by white. The sort of dark center captures your eye. But even with the tilt of the head, you have many angles within the body that flow in directions that constantly turn and change. Slide, please. One of the few other subject matters was of mythology, and he didn't venture into that field too often. But this one, a large painting in the National Gallery in Washington, is of Laocoon, who, with his sons, angered the god Jupiter and were put to death by snake bite and strangulation. This piece of mythology has been a very favorite subject to many of the artists throughout many periods of history, especially the late Renaissance, when they were searching for subject matter that had a little more activity and action in it. Many of the late Renaissance sculptors and the Baroque painters and sculptors have used this subject matter. Slide, please. After the painting was cleaned, it was noted that another figure appeared in the right-hand side and that the landscape appeared quite different in color. Slide, please. He did a whole series of the apostles. It was not meant to be a group because most of the paintings were of different sizes, of different finished qualities, but included the attributes of the different saints within the portrait. Slide, please. Slide, please. Slide, please. Some of them very rough, almost unfinished, in the sketch stage. Slide, please. Slide, please. Slide, please. Slide, please. These are fairly large in scale, about 30 by 40 inches, most of them within that field. Slide, please. As in this one, very unfinished, especially the hand, which is just a notation rather than a finished hand. Slide, please. Slide, please. Slide, please. Slide, please. The second painter that we will look at today is Velasquez, V-E-L-A-S-Q-U-E-Z. His dates are 1599 to 1660. His full name is Diego Rodriguez de Silva y Velasquez. His early style is dominated by the Italian painter Caravaggio, who was a painter interested in light and in sort of genre subject matters or everyday occurrences. From Velasquez's first early works, he was soon appointed, he gained some fame and was soon appointed court painter to Philip IV of Spain and remained the court painter for the rest of his life, turning out quite a few portraits of the royal family, plus the required religious subjects and battle paintings that would be required of a court painter. As I said, there were only really three major Spanish painters: El Greco, Velasquez, who is a Spanish product, and a 19th century painter, Goya, whom we'll see later on in the semester. Of course, there were others: Zurabon, Murillo, Ribera, a few others, but these never achieved the main rank of a great painter. With Velasquez's work, you might say in sort of comparison to Rembrandt, Velasquez was a master of light, but of the reflected light, not of the diffused light of Rembrandt or the sort of physical light, the diffused light of Vermeer, or the the dark lighting of Rembrandt. But Velasquez, all through his career, bounced light and contrasted light one against another. In this, an early scene, as I said, very reminiscent of the Italian Caravaggio, of where you have a strong effect of light that sort of beams in from a direct source, usually from a lower angle, but everything crisply defined, exactingly worked. And some of the later things, as we will see in details of the shimmering surfaces that he achieved in his later life, have not been reached, or were not reached until maybe 200 years later with the Impressionist painters. Slide, please. But as I say, the early periods would be of these fairly dark, rigid genre scenes, activities going on, sort of set pieces, enjoyed by many people, sort of everyday life scenes, nothing very serious or dramatic about it, but nice presentations of daily activities. Slide, please. All through his career, as with any of the painters at this time, religious subjects were of the utmost importance because this is what they received their patronage from. Slide, please. In sort of an unusual holy family, We've not seen the locale interpreted with possibly the Flemish Madonnas within the Flemish interiors, and they all sort of fall into a stereotype. But this way we have, in this one of Velázquez's, we have sort of a feeling of a Spanish family. Even within the dress, it seems a little more somber in tone. Slide, please. A portrait, a commissioned one. There's a stark severity to his early style that loosens up later on. In some of his lighting effects, it almost resembles, in the later ones, Vermeer, although we know that he had no contact with Vermeer. Slide, please. Slide, please. An early Bacchus. This subject was treated very much in the same way by Caravaggio, almost the same pose, except he then sort of turns it within his own style of the darkened use of color, and then the sort of very definitely Spanish individuals on the right-hand side of possibly models that he picked up near his studio. The two men on the right certainly have the earthy quality that the god Bacchus does not have in the figure on the left. Slide, please. Slide, please. As within most Spanish painting, what really sort of tears it down and does not make it of the major works is the sort of sentimentality that is achieved in a lot of their work. Murillo is just too sweet. El Greco borders almost on the overdramatic. And in some of Velázquez's things, it tugs at the heartstrings a bit too much. It becomes theatrical rather than real. Slide, please. In his figure of Christ, you have none of the violence that you have in El Greco, but a very straightforward, formal crucifixion. Slide, please. Detail of a small angel. Notice the overwork in this one, in the freedom that Velázquez achieves in the brushwork, especially in the drapery around the angel's body. Velázquez was one of the first ones to paint directly in the color rather than building up forms. And he would apply the color fairly opaque and then slash it over with these highlights of little colors producing the effect that he wanted. So you have a great freedom within the brushwork of Velázquez's work. Slide, please. The charming thing of Velázquez's paintings, I feel, is in his the royal portraits within the court. It's almost like the pomp of a Gainsborough, except with Velázquez, it's done with a straightforward honesty and not all the theatrics that Gainsborough used later on. You have the very elaborate costumes that immediately catch your eye. They are stiff, formal portraits on the grand scale, and they're exactly that. They're to present the royal family at the most flattering instant. Slide, please. Slide, please. The young prince. They would do many of these sort of mounted things. They even had stuffed horses as props in their very elaborate studios that were within the royal area. They would live with the royal family as one of the family. Slide, please. The major work of Velázquez's middle period is the Surrender of Breda, and it is also called the Lances because of all the lances in the right-hand section of the painting. But there were 12 paintings commissioned by court painters to commemorate different battles that the king was in. And in this one, Velasquez chooses a sort of grand, eloquent pose of the surrender of the sword, the great gestures of where your eye is drawn into the center of the two men sort of in conversation. The light figure on the left-hand side sort of stops the composition, especially the figure directly to his left sort of turning around viewing you as the viewer, that attracts you within the composition. The horse on the right-hand side, a fairly dominant force that leads your eye sort of back around to the lances, was an afterthought, and through X-ray it's been shown that it was painted on top of an almost completed painting at a very late stage in the development of this work. Velasquez very seldom uses that fleeting moment, that stopped action pieces Rembrandt did in the Syndics of the Drapers Guild. Most of his is based on contrast of light and reflected light in a sort of contrast within the paintings. Slide, please. In this, the close-up, we see a much more delicate piece of work. The overall thing has power to it, but when you get close to a Velasquez, the surface shimmers. It seems to be just painted in veils of color, light, delicate tones that sort of come through from underneath. The background in this seems almost just a wash of tone, bare notations of color. There's very seldom a harsh edge in a Velasquez painting when you get up close to it. From a distance, everything stands boldly on its own. But when you get in close, like the sort of cutting line around the nose of the figure on the right-hand side, which sort of isolates it from the background, the change, the raising of the arm, which would be about an inch in the main painting, because it's a very large painting, of the underneath side that you see where it had been painted out, and it sort of bleeds through the painting a little bit. The upper arm of the figure handing the sword that has sort of a blurry look, that almost light falls on the surface of the cuff and the hand, that gives an illuminating quality to that area of the painting. And all the very delicate tones, the pinks and the blues and the beiges that you see between the two arms in the negative space in the far distance. This is what makes Velasquez's paintings glow when you are able to see an original. Slide, please. Another detail from the painting. Slide, please. Another one of the stock royal portraits. Slide, please. One of the princes in a more informal scene. Slide, please. This is the full view of the crucifixion that we saw earlier. The dark backgrounds were very popular in Spanish paintings. Slide, please. This is a little dwarf that was called a fool, or as one of the jesters in the Spanish court. They were very popular. There were quite a few of them, and even though it seems sort of a sad thing that they would select a dwarf to play this role, they were well treated. They were treated almost, though, as pets, as a dog would be, except they did hold great power within the courts because they were very favored people. Velasquez painted about 4 of these dwarfs that were the court jesters. And he does not sympathize with their position or their deformity, but he presents a very straightforward, sort of analytical portrait of the person. Beautifully painted, again with a very simple washed backgrounds with just the highlights brought in that seem to shimmer in the light falling on the subject. Slide, please. Many times when the thing's in canvas, this is the Stigmata of St. Francis, you see the surface texture of the canvas itself, the paint very thin. Slide, please. His Venus. In the contrast that Velasquez loved, he would many times use these reflections, and we'll see it in one of his great portraits later on. Slide, please. Another one of the court dwarfs. Slide, please. The Assumption of the Virgin. Think of this one as in the difference with El Greco's work. How much more formalized this one is than in El Greco's painting. Slide, please. Slide, please.